I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking for about 20 minutes about faking ADHD, a real problem or fake news. Other than actors who might want to be pretending to be someone with ADHD, and I'll get to that a little later, most people who are faking ADHD are doing it for what is called secondary gain. So they're doing it either to get something positive that's attached to having ADHD. And two positive things are, one would be prescriptions for stimulants and stimulant medications in the setting of ADHD, which we know can help with attention, focus, sustained concentration, staying on track functionally in someone's lives, fewer car accidents, fewer other problems. Not only help with focus, attention, and cognition, but they do have a euphoric effect. They do have a mood elevating effect. So that makes them desirable to people who might not have ADHD. And the second reason for faking ADHD is particularly on college campuses and some workplace situations. People are entitled to certain accommodations or particularly more time on tests or leniency with some deadlines in some situations. So that may be a desirable reason people might fake having ADHD when they don't really have it. How common is this? So, one is that there's evidence that on college campuses, up to 20% of kids, and certainly it will vary from college campus to college campus, but maybe 1 out of 5 kids on college campuses are using stimulant medication that is not their own. So that's indicating that there is sort of a market, there is some appeal of having these medications, and many people who are alarmed by this situation, are saying, oh my God, 20% of our kids are drug addicts and running into problems. Closer examination of this phenomenon, though, suggests that the vast majority of those 20% of kids are using it on selective occasions, so not as a daily habit or a regular occasion. And by far the commonest reason these students, maybe I should say rather than kids, these students say that they are using the medications is to study better, to improve performance before a test, to get more information in their head, to stay up later, to schedule or to study. I'm not promoting this as a good study technique, but that is a little different from a much smaller percentage of these students who acknowledge they're taking stimulant medication to feel good. The percentages that endorse that are less than 10%. That's the primary reason that they're taking Adderall or Ritalin in college. We do know that students who do wind up taking other people's, either from borrowing, stealing, buying illicit stimulants, are more likely male than female. They're more likely to be members of frats. They're more likely to abuse other substances and drugs. So that's just some of the demographics of it. But again, that doesn't suggest that there's a rampant problem there. Work with many adults, and some of the adults they have, young adults who are still in college age, very consistently report when we're discussing medication options, and I'd say that the efficacy of Ritalin on many head-to-head studies is not differentiable from Wellbutrin or Strattera or Cymbalta in terms of its efficacy. Adderall pretty consistently does a little better. To a person, these college students have said, it's cool, it's acceptable, it's non-stigmatized for them to have stimulants, Ritalin, Adderall prescriptions, or the medications themselves in the dorm. That probably makes them more popular among their friends. But to be seen taking a medication that's identified as an antidepressant, such as Wellbutrin, that would be stigmatizing, traumatizing, looked down upon as a weakness, even if they were using that medicine purely for their ADHD. So there are some societal attitudes, and what's interesting there is, certainly I've seen that attitude, even outside of the school situation, that many people come to me looking for medication for ADHD, they don't want a medication that's not immediately identifiable as an ADD medication, as a stimulant. On the other hand, when I've treated several doctors over the years, or people who are more knowledgeable about medications, they pretty uniformly say, sure, let's try these non-stimulants first before choosing the stimulants. And part of that is, and getting back to the general concern or alarm about people misusing stimulants, although most people who are misusing them are not running into addiction problems, addiction is one possibility with those drugs. Most studies show that kids prescribed stimulant medications who take them on a daily basis, somewhere between 2 to 4% of kids do develop addiction problems to the stimulants. There's a rare condition called amphetamine-induced psychosis where someone can become completely hyped up and paranoid, and that state can persist even after the drugs left their system. That's a horrible consequence of stimulants. The more common day-to-day side effect is potentially taking too much of it and feeling too agitated, too restless, too rubbed up, unable to sleep. So it's not a class of medications devoid of bad side effects. So the other really interesting thing from the studies of kids who do not have ADHD and are using stimulant medications is that many of them actually probably do have some amount of ADHD. And by that, I mean, we know that ADHD is not a categorical entity, that you have it completely or you don't have it, that it ranges on a degree of severity. Probably almost as many people who meet full criteria for ADHD who have what's called subsyndromal ADHD, where they have a number of ADHD symptoms. They may not be as many to reach full criteria, or they may not be severe enough, or they may have been in situations where they didn't run into problems with it, or they had intelligence or other strengths to rely on that got them through situations. But many of the people who are endorsing stimulant use in college years who do not have an official ADHD diagnosis do meet a number of ADHD criteria and probably are somewhere on that spectrum. Again, I'm not condoning, buying it from your friend or stealing it from your enemy or getting it illicitly. I do believe it's in your best interest to be well evaluated and work with a professional to find out what's the best medication and non-medication treatments. There are websites that will actually teach people how to fake ADHD to get stimulant medication or to get an ADHD diagnosis. So the very existence that there are websites teaching people to do this means that there is some population interested in this. How do doctors or how do people on my side of the equation sort of evaluate whether someone really has ADHD or is just faking it? We have checklists that are commonly used for sort of assessing at one level ADHD symptoms. And it's pretty easy to memorize the checklists or know that someone who's more hyperactive, more unable to sit still, less able to pay attention. If you say that you have those things, that's going to give you a higher score on these ratings. That's not rocket science to figure out how to manipulate it. So what do we try to do to make sure we're not being hoodwinked by someone who doesn't really have ADHD? One important thing is to try to get a corroborative history. If we have teachers who describe inattentiveness in the classroom, if we have parents who say, little Johnny was racing around the playground when they were supposed to be sitting in chairs around the circle, or other signs of impulsivity, hyperactivity, inattentiveness, going back to early childhood, substantiated by others, that's fairly good evidence that the person's not faking it. Another piece that often is recommended to professionals is to make sure that the person's life history matches with what they're telling you. So if they're telling you that they've been inattentive and can't sit through any classroom, and yet they've managed to graduate in college in 4 years and with optimal grades, the suggestion would be maybe they don't really have ADHD. Now, I've seen many people come to me who absolutely clearly, robustly met full criteria, had ADHD affecting them pervasively in many areas of their life, and had seen other professionals who's told them, oh, you finished at a good school, you went through a good college, you couldn't possibly have ADHD, or, oh, you've held that job in your company for 10 years, you couldn't possibly have ADHD. So I think we need more subtlety and nuance when listening to people's life story. So yes, they might have graduated from a good college, but if they had, abysmal grades in the courses they weren't interested in and only thrived in what really grabbed them, that actually would be strongly suggestive of ADHD rather than dismissive of it. If you're using some criteria to finishing college, holding down a job or anything like that as evidence of not having ADHD, I would say right out that person is a quack or doesn't know what they're talking about. Because if we open our eyes right now, we have a president of the United States who unequivocally, unquestionably, fully, robustly, severely meets full ADHD criteria, has since childhood, has it corroborated by thousands of observers and people who have evaluated him, exchanged interactions with him in his own life. If you can be president, don't tell me that there's anything that someone with ADHD might not have done. Again, the question is, how did they achieve it? Did they take twice as long as their peers? Was their performance uneven? Did they take a break and go back to it? Was their intellectual capability that extreme? Were their social skills that good? Did they have supportive people around them helping them sit down after school every day and make sure they did their homework? So again, there is no absolute in someone's history which is going to disprove ADHD. You have to take a more nuanced view of how they achieved what they achieved and whether that pattern of achievement is consistent with ADHD or not. So the other thing, and this often isn't stressed in what I've seen in terms of recommending how doctors should screen out whether someone's faking it or have ADHD, somehow I seem to focus on it more than some of my peers, is that not just listening to someone's story or recounting what they've done on a checklist and are pushed towards making medication more, or making the whole, not medication, but the whole field of medicine more checkbox oriented and objective and measured on assays and tests, is I think we are losing a lot of information. I mean, particularly we're often so busy checking boxes, you're not looking. So actually looking at what the person who's sitting in the office is with you doing. If they are telling you that they're distracted all the time, and yet every one of their sentences is a nice linear sentence, their histories are well organized, and they're not staring out the window or tapping their foot or otherwise displaying ADD symptoms, that's a red flag. It doesn't mean they don't have ADHD, because particularly for people who might not have been diagnosed before, or this may be extremely important and interesting to them to get out their story and to hear your impression of what they have ADHD. They may be very focused during that first session and less focused in subsequent sessions. Watching what someone's doing with their body, with their attention, with the linearity of their thoughts while they're describing things is important information, which often, because we don't have little check boxes for it, is often being neglected. So I say, and I go into this in my book, that there are two little rules I have. These are my rules I've devised. I've not seen anyone else using them, and I think they are both verifiable, but I have not done rigorous research to prove that what I'm saying is true, but I believe it's so, but I'll say. One is my simultaneity rule. And this is particularly fun to pick up in actors. If you look at Alec Baldwin or others who imitate Donald Trump, and they're not even specifically knowing they're imitating ADHD, but given that his ADHD is such a prominent aspect of who he is, they will, include lots of his, excessive hand gestures or his snorting or his head bobbing or other joy. And they may try to employ his nonlinear verbal dialogue. But for someone whose brain doesn't have ADHD and who is a linear, organized thinker, it's very hard for them to simultaneously do the verbal cadences and speech patterns of someone with ADHD and do the physical manifestations. So often they will throw in some twitching and hyperactivity and foot bouncing and drumming. They're talking in a linear fashion. And then when they try to imitate the speech patterns of jumping off on tangents, they will do that while being perfectly calm and still with their body. Someone with, and again, this is more hyperactive form of ADHD, who's doing both, is able to gesture excessively and go off on tangents simultaneously at the same time. So that simultaneously rule is one of my rules. Other thing that I look for is where the pauses in speech are when someone's going off on a tangent. So someone with ADHD, if you listen closely to their speech pattern, if they're talking about going to the mall and then they ran into Jody and she was wearing a pink dress and their mother wore a pink, it's a constant flow of tangentiality, or can be. Often, when they realize they've gone off onto a new topic, they will realize that 2 or 3 words or 2 or 3 sentences or phrases into it and be aware that they may be either losing their original point or be losing their audience, and they will pivot and then pause. Whereas someone without ADHD who's trying to imitate ADHD, and again, you can see this again in people who are trying to sound like Trump, what they will do is they will talk on subject A, and then in their linear mind, they'll pause and say, aha, I'm going to pivot to something really weird, bizarre, off track. They will pause and then pivot. So watching where that subtle pauses in speech are, again, I have not seen others confirm this. I am absolutely convinced that there's something real and valid here. If someone with ADHD pivots into a new area, then pauses sometimes. Someone without ADHD pauses because they have to think of what's going to be tangential or weird or different. So pause, then pivot for a faker, pivot, then pause for someone with ADHD. One of the stranger things in the whole ADHD field, which is fairly defensive about are people abusing their medications, and is a very extensive claim. This is an Attitude magazine and all throughout the ADHD lay literature, is that Adderall, Ritalin, and other stimulants don't even enhance performance in people without ADHD. That, to me, doesn't sound very plausible. Some people are a little more open-ended about it. So there have been certainly studies, and a few have been popularized in recent years, one which gave people without ADHD Adderall and tried to measure how they did on some performance tests, and found that giving everyone in this group of non-ADHD college students, it was either a 20 or 30 milligram dose. Yes, they were a little more attentive during that period. And when they retested them on memory the next day, they actually did worse. So Adderall might be making things worse. What they didn't advertise strongly, but it's right there in their study, is that they were giving doses of these medications which disrupted sleep. Students didn't sleep as well the night after the Adderall. And we know that sleep deprivation is a major determinant in whether you're going to remember things the next day or not. So I'd say the whole field of testing, assessing whether these drugs do or don't help people without ADHD is riddled with problems. It's extremely weak. And I can't believe that hundreds of thousands, millions of people are not trying these drugs multiple times because they're not having any effect on them. And so one of the other claims is they don't really improve performance. They just alter your perception that you've improved your performance. I think they may change your perception of how well you're doing. Certainly there's a euphoric effect that many people have from the stimulants, and it's not just general positivity. It's I'm doing better, I'm doing stronger, and using not just prescription stimulants, but what is the most widely used psychoactive drug on our planet? It's caffeine. People are using these drugs because they observe that at least in some tasks, even if they don't have ADHD, they are a little more attentive, may do a little better on certain tasks. So I'm going to halt it there. I see there's questions and I'm going to try to answer those. Andrew asks, is neuropsychological testing helpful for diagnosis? My strongest arguments about this is Russell Barkley is a psychologist, so he's not a psychiatrist. He's a psychologist, so he doesn't even prescribe medications. His forte, he's one of the most prominent experts in ADHD and popularizing ADHD to the general public and research about ADHD. And he has written extensively and vehemently that in terms of diagnosis, the neuropsychological testing we have offers nothing beyond what a careful clinical evaluation does. I mean, if someone's depressed, that's going to affect memory, it's going to affect reaction time, it's going to affect a whole slew of neuropsychological variables. Anxiety affects them, self-confidence affects them. There's a whole range of non-ADHD things which affects performance on these tests. Even though we tailor these tests supposedly to reveal certain neuropsychological functions, they aren't very good or helpful. And what's particularly galling or stupid about this is that organizations to this day, if you're taking the law tests, the LSATs, if you're taking the GREs, if you're trying to get into medical school, the MCATs, if you want accommodations for ADHD, they often require you go and get neuropsychological testing. Although, as Russell Buckley would say, there is no study that shows that adds any advantage, any benefit, any additional information in terms of determining whether someone has ADHD or not. Do you think adults are overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed with ADHD in the US? And the simple answer is yes, yes. Dozens of books have been, ADHD Nation. Others are claiming ADHD is rampantly overdiagnosed, that there's, kids who are just restless or anxious or agitated or can't sit still are misdiagnosed with it. And I'd say there's some evidence that there's certain regions of the country, particularly in the South, there have been areas where the rates seem suspiciously high, and particularly where people of color may be getting higher rates of diagnosis, and it probably is they're being used as a tool to try to control or rule out or get your kid medicated or they can't come to normal classes. So I'm not questioning whether there are some areas where it is overdiagnosed. The order of magnitude to which it's underdiagnosed is huge. So every epidemiologic study which is carefully evaluated for ADHD symptoms suggests that a minimum of 3% of adults should have ADHD. Some say just 2.7, some actually suggest 4 or 5%. And if you look at the percentage of Americans who are being treated for ADHD, there's a big study that was done in Kaiser of Northern California, my area of the country. There's lots of media attention. Over the last decade, rates went from 1% to 2%. Well, that's still missing probably half the adults with ADHD. Yes, we're picking up on more of it. And I'd say there's definitely a cohort effect. More people who are in their teens, 20s, 30s, we are more aware of ADHD in childhood. We're much more aware of ADHD in adulthood than we were 20 years ago. We are picking it up better at that level. But I've met numerous 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds, and again, Trump is a wonderful example, who have gone through their life clearly with rampant, robust, full force ADHD symptoms. And nobody even considered it was a possibility. As our whole society is getting more ADHD-ogenic, we are going to see more ADHD because we are creating conditions to create more brains with ADHD. What do you think of the Netflix new documentary, Take Your Pills, which exclusively talks about some legitimate concerns about people taking stimulants? So again, as I was saying earlier, the stimulants do have some uncommon, really bad side effects. I talked about addiction. That's in the range of 2 to 4% of kids. Adults are probably lower rate. I've talked more than any expert I know about in my own practice about amphetamine-induced psychosis, because that I think is a much more serious, it's a separate issue from addiction. The experts to a person over the years have said, this is really rare, happens 1 out of 1,000 people. That's really uncommon. Let's look the other way. Finally, when we're getting some better epidemiologic data for Adderall, it's probably happens 1 out of 400, 500 people. And again, given that this is a condition that's not just an intoxication syndrome, continues often for days, weeks, months after someone has it, and even after a single episode of amphetamine-induced psychosis, if you look at people 10, 15 years later, something like 20% of them are in a permanent psychotic state. That's a really serious, really bad, not really common, but not particularly rare side effect of stimulants. We need to be open and direct in talking about that. There's also people with rare cardiac conditions who have a risk of sudden death. Very serious, extremely rare. Most of the common side effects with stimulants are a matter of dosing. Someone is too revved up, and they happen immediately. They're easy to detect. They're almost always a sign of too much and not necessarily a sign that it's a bad chemical for you. In my own practice, I almost always start with non-stimulants, which lack some of those particularly rare, dangerous effects. So I think it's good to provide accurate information about the risks, but we should put those risks into perspective. One last aspect on the addiction front, because that's one that gets a huge amount of attention. What we know in America is that about 15 to 20% of adults, well, say about 15% overall, sometime in their life have serious addiction problems, with alcohol being way at the top of the list. Kids with ADHD and adults with ADHD have lifetime rates of addiction orders twice that, closer to 30%. So just having a brain that has ADHD, making you more impulsive, making you less wisely consider the long-term ramifications of your choice, being more wanting something that's going to give you a big stimulus, a big thrill, that puts you at risk for substance abuse problems. Study after study has shown children with ADHD who are medicated with stimulant medications, and again, maybe 2 to 4% of those kids will become addicted to their stimulants, but the bigger picture is their overall rate of addiction to any substance falls from about the 30% rate back down to the general population rate of 15% or so. And I'm using ballpark figures there, but it cuts it in half. So there's no question overall, your risk of having addiction problems on a stimulant if you have ADHD is lower than if you have ADHD and aren't on a stimulant. That's the data. That's about all for now. Have a good and healthy and happy week, and I will be back next week.